Where we pick up in Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 through 48, Jesus has given us a series of "you have heard it said, but I say to you" statements. And we could spend a lot of time breaking down each of them individually. There's a lot of robust things that we could pull out of each of them. And maybe you spent some more time on a couple individual examples than others in your group discussion. But I want to highlight that there's something specific that Jesus is trying to do in all of these statements. He's got one thing in mind. He's wanting to reorder how his disciples, his followers, the people who enter into his way of life, will see and think about some common teachings that they have heard in their day, in first century Israel. And as we read through the series of teachings here, you may have seen some of these things, but I want to spend the next few moments highlighting some of the specific goals Jesus has in mind, some of the specific things he's breaking down and reordering for his followers as they kind of wrestle through some of these teachings and philosophies and ideologies that keep being presented to them in their culture. He's doing a few things. I think the first thing Jesus is doing as he uses these statements, "You've heard it said, but I say to you," he's doing something first. He's revealing the true intent of God's commands. Oftentimes the commands of God at this point have been used to excuse behavior. And Jesus uses some specific examples right here. He talks about divorce and marriage. He says, "Now it was said, whoever sends his wife away is to give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife except for the reason of sexual immorality makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." And this teaching, the thing that had been said in Jesus' day, comes from a permission that is given from God in Deuteronomy chapter 24 that allowed for, in specific cases, a man to divorce his wife. And in many in Jesus' day, unfortunately, this was actually just used as an opportunity for abuse. Once she, my wife, displeases me for any reason, I can cast her out simply. I can use her as a commodity before simply moving on to the next woman. And to make matters worse, in their culture, thanks patriarchy, women in the first century who had been divorced often had no means to care for themselves or for their families. They were labeled as outcasts of society and left out to dry with no opportunity for a reasonable way of life. And Jesus is saying, as he juxtaposes, okay, this is what you've heard said, but here's what I'm saying to you. Jesus is saying that this is an abuse of God's law. He's saying the commands of God were not intended to excuse our behavior. Many of God's laws are simply creating allowances that would hopefully bring justice to communities and restoration to relationships. But what happened to many laws, as Jesus is revealing to us, is that they became allowances to get my pound of flesh or even to take advantage of other people. Mark chapter 10, verse 5, Jesus says, "Because of your hardness of heart, he wrote you this commandment," referring to this allowance for divorce. This commandment was God's concession to allow divorce in rare cases, not his permission to break a marriage apart flippantly. It's never been God's desire for marriages to be torn apart. This is what Jesus is saying. He does the same thing he's done here. In this teaching that's been heard about divorce, he does the same thing in verse 38. He says, "You've heard it said, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not show opposition against an evil person." This instruction, this teaching, this ideology, this eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, it's rooted in God's law. It's rooted in Exodus chapter 21, communicating that the punishment must fit the crime. But this was not intended to be a, hey, great, I get to break your leg because you broke mine. This is intended to scale back the retribution of an offended party. You see, prior to Exodus chapter 21, if somebody came to your house and stole your cow, guess what people would do? They wouldn't go to your house and steal their cow. They'd go to your house, kill you and your family, and burn down your house and take all of your livestock. And really, this eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, the guidance was simply to scale back the violence, to say, you're not allowed to do more to another person than what has been done to you. But what has happened is this was a step to bring people closer and closer to the heart of God. It's, in this context, being abused as well. It's intended to scale back things. It's supposed to temper back the violence only to what is equivalent retribution. But in this day and age, it was often used to justify retribution. That, hey, if you killed my family member, I get to kill yours no matter what. More on this specific example in a second. We'll talk about it a little bit more. But Jesus is doing something here with just these two examples. He's tearing down old teachings and he's installing new ones. He's revealing what God's heart has been all along. Just because God has given concessions does not mean these end results are what he truly desires for us. And Jesus is working to reframe the true intent of some of God's commands because they've been twisted. That's the first thing Jesus is doing here. And the second is this: Jesus is calling out the external priorities of the Pharisees. Some of the teachings of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and other religious elite were simply self-interested. They were simply interested in looking good for themselves, but then also just purely motivated by external priorities, completely motivated by modifying the behavior of people and saying that this is what holiness is all about. Verse 21, Jesus said, "You've heard it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment. But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whoever says to his brother, Raka," have you ever said Raka at anybody? Probably not. But if you have, Jesus said that person shall be in danger of the council. But whoever says, "You fool," shall be in danger of hellfire. This is what the Pharisees and religious leaders believed. That God said don't murder people, but guess what? Anything up to that point was permissible. So go ahead and maim him and mess him up real bad. As long as you don't murder him, you haven't broken any laws. Jesus was pointing out that the Pharisees' primary motivation was what they could get away with rather than pursuing true love and unity. They were missing the point of God's law. This is what Jesus is calling out to them. Jesus was revealing that they put so much emphasis on external behavior, yet took no care to address the deep sin within all of us, which is the true root of all outward sin. They were saying, I don't need a law preventing me from harming my neighbor if I've truly dealt with the anger in my heart, right? I'm not going to have an issue with murder if I've dealt with the internal anger that I carry around in my heart. He does the same here regarding adultery. He says, for sure adultery is destructive. Don't commit adultery. But if I just attempt to moderate my behavior, yet allow sin in my heart, it doesn't work. It's just a matter of time before that inward desire manifests in outward behavior. And even if I could control myself, which, spoiler alert, you can't, I still allow sin to dwell in my mind and my heart rather than conforming all parts of my being to the righteousness of God. And it's true that in our era, much like Jesus' time and place, just as it was in the first century, that our modern era has obsessed over modifying our behavior to conform to maybe God's laws or whatever laws we subscribe to, while allowing our inward life, our thoughts and our desires to rot away under the corrosive power of sin. Jesus is saying that was never God's desire for us. And he calls us not just to examine our behavior, but to address the deep wound that is causing the bleeding. He's rebuking the external priorities of the Pharisees. And third, he's inviting us into a new way of life. Jumping back to this teaching Jesus has on the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth idea, Jesus has shown us that commands like this were simply stepping stones along the path, slowly walking us closer and closer to God's true heart. And Jesus' teaching to follow, no matter what has been allowed as a concession in the past, he gives us the fullest expression of the Father to his people. In spite of all the concessions and allowances that have been made because of our hard-heartedness, here is the Father's true desire for our relationships, as we can see in Jesus, that we would extend sacrificial, self-giving love to others, not just those we call friends, but even to those we might consider our enemies. Jesus says, turn the other cheek. Give them your jacket. Go the extra mile. We don't have time to break down every single one of these, but they're so rich and interesting, radical, countercultural calls that Jesus is offering to every one of us. But the message is clear. No matter what is done to us, no matter what we may reasonably deserve, Jesus' disciples respond with self-giving love. Not turning the offending party's evil back against them, but absorbing it, releasing it, and extending forgiveness and mercy in response. Jesus is calling us to a new way of life. Why? He's calling us to a new way of life in which we not only examine our behavior, but the sin that is so deeply rooted in each of our hearts. He's calling us to reject the world's motivation of getting what I deserve or making others pay for how they've hurt me. He's calling us to live in a way that's deeply peculiar to the world around us, but a way of life that sounds the trumpet that a new way, a new kingdom is truly here.